We're back in action. So again, welcome everyone to CERIP. We're really excited for this discussion today. On that note of excess noise, I would ask you all to stay muted. And indeed, I don't think you have the power to unmute yourself, which is handy for us at the moment. The way it's going to work is that I would please invite you to put any questions you have into the chat. We're going to be spending about 40 minutes talking with the panelists here, the five of us, and then the last 20 minutes will be reserved for your questions. At that time, I will kind of look through the chat and see who has ideas they would like to share, questions they would like to raise. I would ask that you please put the word "speak" in parentheses next to your question if you would like me to unmute you so you can read the question yourself and interact a bit more with the panelists. If not, I'll happily read it out loud for you. Big thanks to Elaine Wilson and to Paula, who are in the virtual ether here, who supported this entire event, and a huge thank you to our panelists. So the reason why we're here today really is that there is so much happening in teacher education at the moment, specifically here in Cambridge and in the United Kingdom. For those of you who are not familiar, and again, Susan will, I'm sure, happily speak about this soon, the Department for Education recently released a market review on initial teacher training, which, among other things, basically said that there should be a whole re-credentialing process for universities that provide teacher education. There is a bit of controversy around this, around who is at the table, who is not at the table in this consultation process, and what sorts of futures this presents for the kind of university-based teaching system. It speaks to a broader movement and a broader moment, I think, in educational policy around privatization, around kind of perhaps some might call it deprofessionalization or alternative forms of professional development that exist in America for quite some time, such as Teach for America, and globally, Teach First, Teach for All, and the related networks. It's very contentious, but I think that one thing we can all agree on is that there's no real simple answer here. There's no silver bullet that's going to solve teacher education forever. So I hope that today we can really tease out and unpack what we have learned from new experiments, what we have learned from traditional forms of university-based teacher education, and where we might go from here. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our wonderful panelists. First, we have Susan Robertson, who is the head of the Faculty of Education here and a professor of education sociology. Her expertise is all around transformations of the state, education policy, region building, and global processes. And she's also written quite a bit about teachers and the kind of the history of teacher training and how it fits into the kind of global reform agenda and discussion. We're also joined by Dr. Matthew Thomas, who joins us from Australia at a very late hour. He is a senior lecturer in comparative education and sociology of education at the University of Sydney, and he focuses on pedagogical practices and teachers' lives, and indeed recently co-edited a volume on the proliferation of programs related to this sort of model of alternative teacher education that he is showing you right there, Teach for All. We also have Professor Megan Blumenreich, who is a professor of childhood education in the City College of New York, at the City University of New York, the system there. She is the editor-in-chief of The New Educator, which focuses all on supporting new teachers. And she recently co-authored a book with our other lovely panelist, Dr. Bethany Rogers, all about the history of initial teacher training in America, and specifically Teach for America, which she is showing you right there. So we'll send out all links in due course so you can browse the really fantastic volumes. I think you'll enjoy. So last but certainly not least is Dr. Bethany Rogers, in fact, who is an associate professor of educational studies at the College of Staten Island, also in the City University of New York system. She's a historian of education who uses historiography and historical methods to think about inequalities today. So with that introduction under our belts, I'd like us to kind of just do a rapid fire sort of get to know each other round where we see where each of these panelists are coming from, because we have lots of different geographical expertises, lots of different professional backgrounds. So I would ask each of you just to, in 30 seconds to 1 minute, share with all of us what is perhaps that really norths your conversation, that has really been the aha moment that defines a lot of what you're going to speak about on teacher education today. I know that's no small feat just to encapsulate all your thinking in one experience or reading, but what might come to mind to help give the audience an idea of where you're coming from? And perhaps if we could start with you, Matthew.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really great question and certainly a lovely way for us to get to know each other in our backgrounds and professional work better as well. I guess mine stems from my own experience as a government or public of sciences and education program, and had a lot of really wonderful professors in education teaching me a lot of things along the way. And so my example, therefore, is when I was out doing what we would consider student teaching in the United States, what they call internship in Australia, and it goes by different names in different places, but the prolonged period of teaching practice, usually at the end of a more traditional teacher education program. And I was just reflecting today on how beneficial it was to be able to have this kind of multitude of examples and strategies and techniques and other things to pull from as I was learning to be a teacher in this kind of teaching practice experience. And most of those were from my teacher education program and were from specific professors that said, here's one way to describe X concept. Here's another way to think about it, on and on and on. And it was really beneficial for me to have those in my toolkit and in my back pocket, and having already thought through those types of things as I was doing that in the classroom. And in contrast, if I may add to that one very quickly, I also had a couple of experiences in my practice teaching in this long, prolonged period of engagement and internship that were not well structured from the cooperating teacher who was in the school. And so for me, I think that reinforces the idea that merely being in schools is not necessarily an excellent, well-structured learning experience. And so I think we need to kind of think about both those things, the things that we might learn in our teacher training, as well as the things that we might learn in our classroom experiences, with a bit more nuance than often gets picked up in the conversation.
Fantastic. And I really hope that we can pick up on that thread of actual teacher practitioner experiences later in this conversation. Absolutely. Megan, I would invite you to share next.
So I entered the field of education as a Teach for America core member in 1990. And after that, a few years after that, I taught in Compton, California. I taught 7th grade English, and then eventually went to Teachers College at Columbia University, where I took several courses with Linda Darling Hammond. So if I have to think about like a crystallizing moment, it was hearing her critique of Teach for America right after I had come from the program that really got me to rethink everything that I thought was true. So that was really important. I ended up taking 3 courses with her because I really couldn't get enough of trying to understand what she was saying and where she was coming from. And then another very important moment in my life as an educator was working for about 5 years at a multidisciplinary clinic in Washington Heights in New York with families affected by HIV and AIDS. And I got to see how social workers and psychiatrists and psychologists and educators all work together to help not just the individual child, but the whole family around a variety of issues. And that really informed for me a lot about how I think about education at this point.
Fantastic. And I think we'll start off right after this discussion about with a little dive into what Teach for America is, because I know not all of us might be familiar with that model. So I would invite Susan to come next if you'd be willing to share. Are you able to unmute, Susan?
Yes.
Oh,
perfect. Okay. Gosh, I've had a very long academic career. So where do you start? Probably just 2 moments. One of the things that people who look at my kind of biography often say to me, oh, is that your PhD? Because I wrote a book called A Class Act. And it came after my PhD. And I'd done my PhD on transformations of the state in Canada, corporatism and so on. And I got back to Australia, and I'm back into the fray, and I'm talking to people there around what's happening, in this case, Western Australia. And then they'd be saying things like, it's just that, and I'm going to name him Max Angus, he went off to Stanford and he got a newfangled idea and he brought it back. But what they were describing is actually new public management, which was being rolled out in the 1990s. And so I wanted to write this book on teachers to actually try and also understand the way in which teachers themselves that get caught up in many of these reforms, but often don't have a developed understanding of the kind of broader political economy. But coming, and then I'm going to fast forward to some things that really kind of matter to me right at the moment. I'm in battle with the government, literally with number 10 Downing Street emails coming into my email box, but we'll get onto that later. But I'm interested, I've been interested for a long time in questions of governance, and that can take you up to global governance, or it can take you right back down into horizontal, into other forms of governance. But I'm really taken with people like, at the moment, Quinn Slobodian's work, who's pushing for a much more nuanced, he's a cultural historian, a much more nuanced understanding for us around how we read neoliberalism, for example. And why that becomes important, and we see it in the mix even with what's going on in schools, is asking us to come away from, let's say, easy, lazy thinking, let's say Hayek, economic calculus, because actually Hayek, when he goes back to Switzerland, actually decided that culture mattered and that we were culturally different, some more superior than others, unfortunately. But there was another wing that that kind of split off amongst the neoliberal camp, which actually basically said the difference is race, and some of us who are racially superior to others. And that begins to now help you understand the rise of populism and so on. And while that might seem to be, it's not related particularly to what's going on in the world of teacher training. Fundamentally it is, because some of the reforms that I'll get into a little bit later are kind of somewhat predatory actually also on the left behind communities and so on. So yeah, I'm up for nuance in this story.
So much, Susan. Yeah, very, very excited to dive into the current experiences and past ones as well soon. So Bethany, I will invite you to share your experience.
So I started my path into education working for a man named Ted Sizer, who was a reformer here. And it's an interesting sort of historical fact that the field really took a different direction. But he sort of instigated my interest in graduate study, and the coalition was really based on teachers having decision-making power and sort of student as worker, teacher as coach, these idea of principles that a school would be organized around. And so that was my kind of understanding, limited, of the field. And I did my dissertation on the National Teacher Corps, which was a Great Society program, a little bit of a predecessor to Teach for America. But the idea was just that they were going to train teachers for the particular environments of what they then called disadvantaged schools and populations. And I think what was interesting was reading all the critiques in the 1960s about quote unquote conventional or traditional teacher training, and assuming rather naively at the time that we must have dealt with many of those things, and then landing in a teacher education department and kind of recognizing that actually a lot of the complaints that teacher candidates made in the 1960s were quite similar to complaints that teacher candidates were making, in the early 2000s and kind of on. So I think that that's really where my interest in teacher training started. And I liked a lot of what Susan was saying, because as a historian, context is so important. And this notion of if we acknowledge the broader context, how should that frame the way that we prepare teachers to take on these roles, number one. And number two, I think that the work that Megan and I did really helped us to also acknowledge the importance of the school conditions. And so I do remember having a conversation with Ted Sizer, where he said, you could turn out the most perfect teachers you want. Where are you sending them that they can actually make a difference? So just to complicate everything, I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So to perhaps start on a glass half full note here, I'm curious, actually, if we could kick it back to you, Bethany, to start. What do you think is among the most useful learnings that we've had from new experiments with initial teacher training and education? And I would love it if you could just really quickly explain what Teach for America, Teach for All, that kind of ethos and model is for those who might be unfamiliar. And then from there, maybe analyzing that from the point of view of your and Megan's book, what have we taken away that's positive from that? What have you learned that's positive from that before we kind of start critiquing?
So I think that's a great question. And I just want to, again, harken back to some of the introductions by saying that one of the things that Megan and I were really eager to do in the book was to sort of give an even-handed review of how things had emerged and the status, of these reforms at this point, because the debate here has become so polarized. There is no room for nuance in large part. Teach for America was initiated in 1990. Megan was a charter corps member. And the idea was that you were going to recruit graduates from elite institutions of higher education to make a 2-year commitment to teaching in some of the most challenging environments across the nation. And you were prepared with the first year, it was 8 weeks. And then I think they've since cut it to 6 weeks, a summer institute that was meant to give you enough to kind of get off the ground. One little known fact is that most states also required corps members to enroll in some kind of teacher preparation study. So even though the rhetoric of TFA was all about like, we're the alternative, we're the opposite, quite often they were subscribing to university-based teacher education courses so that the candidates, the corps members, could actually work, because states had rules about, who could teach and who couldn't, based on kind of certification. And very quickly, I think what Megan and I looked at that was positive coming out from TFA is just understanding that things like TFA had happened at other historical moments, and TFA really kind of caught fire at the particular moment because of the historical context, and also we would argue because of some sort of gaps or weaknesses that existed in university-based teacher education. So I think that the real strengths, and if I could just say even 2 things, one would be this deep focus. And I think Matthew said, it's not that time in the classroom itself is so great, but I think that TFA and its ilk shifted us to thinking about how do we support teacher candidate learning in the classroom so that it's not classes in the university and then we send you to the schools. And then the other thing, and I know this might be a little contentious, but I think the kind of the alacrity with which TFA sort of was willing to turn around and revise and rethink. And there was a level of, one could argue there's a level of accountability they've never taken, but there's also a level of accountability that I think is greater than, for example, professors in teacher education. I can teach a great course or a terrible course, and it may or may not matter to the individual that I teach. So I think just that kind of tight loop and the sense of kind of responsibility, and this idea that the clinical engagement is a place where teacher educators really need to focus and structure, as I think Matthew said earlier. I would start the discussion with that. I think there's probably more, but I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. And Megan, I would then invite you to share, perhaps from your personal experience and of course from all of your research, something similar. What kind of lessons have you learned that are positive and we should maybe take away from this new model of teacher education?
Well, in terms of being positive, I think Teach for America, and they talk about it a lot, has done a good job of bringing people into education and to recruiting and to making education an exciting field to be a part of. They really tried to make it seem like a movement that young people wanted to be involved in, that felt very idealistic. And I'm purposefully not sharing the other side to those. There's something positive about that. I think in schools of ed, we haven't quite made education an enticing field for lots of young people. And there's something to learn about that from Teach for America. So I would say that's a very, very strong aspect of the program. The field of education has pointed out that our problems right now are more than recruitment, that we need to now really focus on how are we going to support teachers, particularly in high poverty areas. And so I just want to make sure that highlight that that's definitely an important issue. But as far as what Teach for America has done well, I think some of the excitement about being in the field, about teaching, about giving back, although that's also problematic in a lot of ways when you think about teaching. But those have been some positive aspects to the field. And then just in my day-to-day life as a teacher educator in a university-based program, I think programs like Teach for America have brought some competition to the field, and some competition is okay. Like, we're aware that we have to do a good job, and we work really hard because we're aware that there are other programs out there that have maybe more streamlined, sleeker programs. So when we decide to include a course, we want to make sure that the course is really going to be giving something to our students. And I think that type of pressure is not bad for teacher education.
Fantastic. And I want to echo, I think, what you both have said, that no one here is endorsing any one model at this time. I think it's just interesting to tease out the benefits and the drawbacks of each type of model that we've experienced. So Matthew, I would go to you briefly just to think about the Teach for All umbrella. And when you've studied internationally, are there any sort of, by any outcome metrics rather, if we're thinking about teacher retention, satisfaction, impact on students' lives, happiness, is there something to be learned from this sort of model, or do you kind of land more on the side of critique? What is your thought?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think almost always, doesn't matter whether we're talking about Teach for All or something else, I think there's almost always something to be learned. I would hope so. In this particular instance, I think one of the things as we look across the Teach for All network, I haven't checked today, they seem to be launching new programs almost on a monthly basis, but I think we're up to about 60 different organizations around the world. And so that's a really sizable number. And one of the things that I think the organization seems to have done quite well is to build a network across these different affiliate programs in different countries, and then, ostensibly build a network of teachers and educational leaders from around the world. And so they have an annual global conference convened by Teach for All, where representatives from each of these organizations come, plus other representatives from other kind of like-minded organizations. They share best practices, they have presentations, et cetera, et cetera. And so there really is a global network of people who are connected to this particular movement. And I think that's often something that's difficult to do in other kind of university-based programs that are in particular localities or geopolitical context or educational context. So I think there is something that we can be learned from that kind of systemic approach of looking across an entire network to try to affect some type of change at a higher level.
And Susan, I'd invite you to comment on the university side of things. What do you think we absolutely need to keep? What have you learned perhaps as during your time here at the faculty and in all of your studies of sort of teacher training regimes around the world about what is kind of essential at the core of this endeavor?
So what I'd probably say I've learned from here in Cambridge, we have a partnership arrangement with schools where students are in the university and then they're out in the schools. And Cambridge, though it might be an elite institution, is actually located in a part of England where in the surrounding area, there's really significant deprivation. And our partner schools in this kind of region, our students go into around 250 partner schools across the region, many of them actually in quite small, rural, high poverty areas and so on, and they're publicly funded. So you could see that there might be a temptation for Cambridge to place their training teachers into private establishments and that kind of stuff. And it's a very highly, managing this partnership in such a way that the relationship between the university and the school is actually a co-partnership, a proper co-partnership. So, for example, I co-chair the PGCE primary and also the secondary, and that flip-flops between myself and someone who represents the partner schools. So when we get that kind of relationship right, where we're thinking constantly, and I'm really not me, but my colleagues here who engage in this kind of program, it's very moving. I have to celebrate annually the students when they graduate and their stories, but most recently a few came in and met our local MP on this market review, and what they get from the university is the space to both reflect and think critically. And one of them gave an account most recently of where one of the first lessons that they had to do is actually teach the Holocaust, and basically said, you know, if they had not had a space to think critically, reflexively about how to handle something as huge and as complicated as that, and that came from their time in the university thinking about those things, that when they were able to, in the practice moment, they were able to link those two spaces. So my sense is that actually these partnership arrangements, which are really complicated to put into place, they require a high level of maintenance, management, care, thoughtfulness and things like that. And because you don't flick your finger and make those things happen. Basically, they happen because people do a huge amount of work to pull that off. And the thing I would probably say about this kind of school-based partnership arrangement, which they all put into place in the 1990s, is when they work incredibly well. It's not because we've got necessarily you know, particular kinds of schools that we're using, that we actually do manage to produce outstanding teachers. And then we would actually say that outstanding teacher makes a huge difference to the kind of lives that Megan and Bethany are kind of talking about, you know, disadvantaged environments and so on. So that's when you really get it right. But I can talk not now about what the government seems to me to be doing here, that actually that getting it right is in the balance now.
Perfect. Absolutely. So yeah, I would love to come to that next. So now to go a little bit more pessimistic side of things, I'm curious, first perhaps from Megan and Bethany, since you interviewed many teachers who've gone through the Teach for America experience, thinking from the perspective of an educator, what have you heard most that is missing from the current models of teacher education, whether they are Teach for America and these alternative certifications or university-based education platforms? I'm curious what teachers are saying is not working for them. So maybe Megan, you'd like to start.
Well, what teachers are saying, what we've always heard from teachers from both Teach for America and from university-based programs, is that they would like something that they can use tomorrow in the classroom. They would like some support right away for what works, that they can implement right away in the classroom. And while that's very important, and I think clinical work can do a lot to really support that, I think also from a university-based program, I think I understand that that we also need some big ideas to provide to our teacher candidates, that they need some kind of theoretical understanding of why they're doing, and not just techniques that they can take right away for the next day. And the reason is because we're preparing them for a whole career. We're not just preparing them for their first jump into a classroom. So we need to provide them with understandings that they can continue to adapt throughout their career, no matter what population they're working with and what context they're working with. In my work at City College, I've been there for about 20 years, and our student body has changed over that time. And I need to know how to adapt my teaching and learn from my students so that I can do a good job no matter who my students are. And so some of those theoretical pieces are really important. So while the students may say they want techniques for tomorrow, I think we want to provide that and help them to adapt the theoretical ideas in practice through careful teaching. But we also want to provide them with a really good base of ideas about development, ideas about structural inequality, so that they understand how we got to where we are in the schools, and that it's not just kids needing to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but, you know, a deeper understanding of what our situation is, about the economics, about all sorts of social services that are available to our students. So we have a lot to teach our students for a lifetime of teaching. And so what they'll ask for and what we want to give them may be slightly different.
Fantastic. And I would actually invite Bethany, and then we can kind of keep going with others too, to bring us up perhaps one step. I'm curious because teacher training does not exist in isolation. You know, it interacts with schooling needs, with hiring bureaucracies, with university funding exigencies, and so much else. And often these systems are not serving one another well at all. What do you think is perhaps, what structural changes do you see that could be made across these systems that would maybe support the types of learning that teachers that you've spoken to would like, and that your kind of research has suggested would be important?
Well, I don't think it's just our research. I think that there's a lot of research out there that does point the way. And I think that's one thing that Megan and I were gratified to see, is it's not necessarily that we don't know how to do this, but I think you sort of stole my thunder there, Adam, because basically the systems within which we're working are not really designed to work together in a way that I think would be, you know, optimum or ideal. So I was listening to Susan talk about those partnerships, and I think like a deep partnership is, you know, exactly what you would aim for. But the truth is that, for example, higher education, the system of incentives and rewards does not reward faculty for deep partnerships in the field, you know, and I think Megan said it so beautifully. I'm going to be a little balder about it. I think students get very frustrated because they, whether it's we don't do a good enough job or our partnerships don't speak enough in the same language, I think students find it very difficult to translate the theoretical understandings that they're getting at the university into what does that look like in terms of my practice. They also may be going into environments where they're hearing one thing in the university and they're seeing something quite different play out in a school environment. And I say that very particularly from the context of the New York City Department of Education, which is a monstrous bureaucracy. So that may be at the far end. But I think to make the kinds of changes, I do think that it's more than just a matter of funding, but I also think that many of our kind of flagship training institutions have steadily, the states have divested in these, you know, kind of state anchored institutions. And I think to really do this well, for example, a cooperating teacher, if you want that to be a real mentor teacher partnership, that person has to be compensated and supported. It can't just be, you know, we'll give you 3 credits towards, you know, a course that you don't want or need. So I think that there are things that it would be exciting to think broadly about. I get a little cowed when I try to think of those things, only because, like I said, I feel like the systems within which we are working are very definitely not designed to accommodate some of what would be the best sort of innovations that might move us forward, which means really kind of trying to rethink how some of those systems would work.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the biggest criticisms that's leveled at you know, the sort of the alternative education movement for teacher education is that it lifts up a lot of entrepreneurial, technocratic expertise and logic, and sort of denigrates or looks down upon traditional teaching expertise, does not really look at university teaching as something that is valuable in the conversation. So thinking along those sort of dialogic lines, I was wondering if Matthew could speak first, and Susan, we could go to you to talk about kind of governance and the role of who is at the table and what logics are kind of underpinning these. But Matthew, if you wouldn't mind starting first and just talking about when you're looking at kind of the Teach for All agenda and across nations and teacher identity formation, what do you note about dialogue, participation, and teacher voice that perhaps might be emulated and taken up in other locations, and what is maybe not so hopeful?
I mean, we have like 5 hours for this webinar. Is that right? I mean, no, It's a fabulous question. It's a huge question, of course. I mean, I think there's so many related issues. I mean, just briefly to pick up on what Bethany and others have said previously, I think the role of discourse, I think, is really important for us to consider in the way that kind of issues of teachers, teacher quality, teaching quality, these kind of phrases and other discourses get positioned through the media and get positioned in kind of our everyday language and certainly by the government as well. And I think that's really important for us to consider because it ties into all of the points that have been made previously. So, you know, Megan's point about this kind of just in time, just tell me what I need to do to be an effective teacher tomorrow. It comes from that teacher as technician, automatron, teacher quality kind of discourse that just kind of, I think, sinks the entire ship, whether we're talking about traditional teacher education, quote unquote, or new forms of teacher training as well. So I think that's really, really important for us to consider. I mean, in terms of issues of governance, and I feel a little bit nervous answering before Susan does, but nonetheless, I mean, I think it's really important for us to consider because when we look at institutions or organizations like Teach for America and other affiliate organizations of Teach for All, there are particular ways of moving and ways of functioning. And so Helen Baxendale, who she's a Teach for Australia alumna who did her PhD at the University of Oxford recently on the history of Teach for America, you know, she uses this phrase institutional subversion in this way that kind of a whole cadre of people are brought up through a system, through Teach for Australia, through Teach for America, et cetera. They got 2 years or more years of experience, and then they go out and they find themselves in positions of power where they can affect much, much higher change. And so that kind of subversion from within is partly what made some of these organizations so effective. One of the things that I've been really fascinated with recently, and this is kind of one of the new directions that I want to take some of my own research, is looking at sites of reversal or sites of resistance. And so there have been some of these. Scotland, of course, for those of you in the UK, is a really perfect example that for a long time has really resisted Teach First UK. And I think that's really fascinating. In the Australian context, Teach for Australia has been exceptionally strong in Victoria and a couple of other states. It was in ACT, the Australia Capital Territory, but they were recently kicked out of the ACT just as of like a year and a half ago, because the education minister essentially said that it was too much money. Teachers weren't staying. There were other ways that we could spend our kind of sparse dollars in education. And so, you know, I think these kind of, and in the US, we could look at, you know, Houston Integrated School Districts, California. I mean, there are a couple of other examples where there have been votes to kick out Teach America that were then later overturned. Pittsburgh, TFA always wanted to launch in Pittsburgh, and they had an office there, but then it never got going, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, you know, kind of thinking about broader issues of educational change and issues of governance, I think there's some really interesting questions about when, how, and why new forms of teacher training are able to get a foothold. And in the case of TFA, I mean, you know, 50,000 alumni, like something is working strategically for the organization. But there are also these other instances where it hasn't worked. And I think those are some fundamental questions that I'm really interested in trying to answer in the next couple of years.
Wonderful. And I would pass it to you, Susan, then to talk to us just about governance, participation, and what is actually happening kind of at the macro political and also micro political level in your experience too as head of faculty here.
Well, you started off with the question of structural changes, and I mean, Linda Darling-Hammond and many others will actually write and say, and there's huge amounts of evidence in those systems where teachers are valued and paid well, it has effects on the education system. They end up being outstanding education systems if we were to kind of look across the piece. And so it seems to me the interesting question is, what is it, why is it that, for example, here, a government is so determined to move forward with a specific model, and actually it would be the Teach First kind of model. Those graduates, for example, have found their way into being special advisors to the minister, and found their way into being the education policy advisors in number 10 Downing Street. And these are two different policy kinds of spaces. And it's very difficult, actually, it seems to me, if you're my colleagues who've got deep expertise, to be told that this is what a teacher training reform is going to look like, when they basically also in these meetings that I'm at basically say, well, I don't know anything about teacher training, and I've never done one of these kind of reforms. Or I'll be in another meeting and the special advisor, is talking to, if we added all of our experiences up across the group of us who've come together, and we work collectively together to have advance an opposition, actually, Matthew, against this. We've joined up Oxford, Cambridge, the Russell Group, the UCL, and so on, and to be actually kind of be told on this market review that actually somehow we just misunderstood things, as if we can't read English. But this is actually, it's an ideological battle fundamentally, and where a minister wants to wind in and tighten up the control over what knowledge is actually being taught. So I suspect that maybe Teach First, Teach for America, whichever kind of, they get caught up in, I'd say, situated political struggles over knowledge production and what knowledge is. So in this particular case, the accreditation would actually screw down tight and throw the key away on some specific tropes that a minister kind of thinks are really important. So pick up little idle things like a knowledge-rich curriculum or phonics, and that's now in the accreditation. The first clue you also get, it seems to me, as to what's up is the word called market next to the word called education. Bells here to teacher education, not teacher training. And I think one of the battles that we should advance kind of across the different countries is to actually recover the word called education away from the word training. I think what we should do is, we've certainly done this. We've been working with Education International, trying to get material out, insights out into the different kind of world across beyond England and so on. So we could do a lot, it seems to me, as people who can and do and weigh in on spaces to actually change some of the terms of the debate. And there's a huge wall of opposition here that we've managed to kind of log on. We got people actually putting up their responses to the market review, and we could log all of those on and actually show not that it was just Oxford and Cambridge just saying, well, we're not going to do it. It's actually the sector is actually saying that this is bad. The sector is saying this, and that we're not actually speaking for an elite institution. We're actually speaking for the sector and giving voice to the sector. Now, I often hate the word giving voice, but in a sense, that's what we've been trying to do.
There's so much to say on this topic, so I hope we can circle back to these kind of structural and political questions too. But I see that Bethany wanted to add a point. Would you like to go ahead, Bethany?
Yeah, it just Matthew sort of introduced it and then Susan expounded upon it. But I think one of the fascinating things that Megan and I found when we were doing our work is one of our aims was to situate historically, like, why did TFA kind of catch when it did? Because it's not the first time that we've tried things like that, or we've tried to innovate. And one of the things that we found was that there was a very rich context for this. So if you look at, in America, the 80s is the time where sort of you get the Reagan Revolution. And so it's larger than even the sector, right? It's this larger, as Susan was saying, it's almost like an ideological surround where suddenly the market is king. You have this premium put on kind of entrepreneurship. You have a sense that the running of many public entities could be better accomplished by private entities. So it's in many ways, and I feel like, not to get too grandiose, but we're in a similar, at least in America, inflection point now where we're sort of trying to consider what is our government, meant to do. And I think very much similarly in the early 90s when TFA emerged, it emerged and was able to kind of ride these coattails of this larger political movement. So I concur completely with what both Matthew and Susan have said in terms of this can't just be an intra-section conversation. Like, it really does have to be a larger political dialogue because it's pushing back at a worldview really that I think many of us would say is not warranted and does not serve teacher training well.
questions in the chat, by the way. We have 2 that have come in, but before we dive into them, and since we're running out of time, which always seems to happen, I wanted to get one question in though about sort of teacher profiles and who is going into teaching and how these different models affect the sort of teaching pool and the teacher job force. I'm curious, in America, right, in Teach for America, there is this idea of the best and the brightest who are pulled into this cohort system. In America, there is also a deep issue with teacher diversity and representation. And I'm less familiar with the UK and the Australian context, but I'm curious if anyone on the panel, and please feel free to raise your hands and just go for it, would like to talk about what we might have learned from any of these experiments, whether university-based or extra university, about diversifying the teacher workforce and actually ensuring that we have the teachers that we, yes, go ahead, Megan, yes, that we would like to educate our children in the future.
Well, I think, Teach for America has shown it's provided a lot of money and support to bring people from elite colleges to teach for a couple of years in schools that are economically disadvantaged. And I think that if we wanted to really put teachers, high quality teachers instead to support, and Bethany and I write about this in the book too, to support putting teachers, maybe first generation college students, people like around the schools that both Bethany and I work in, where they're going to, they're the first in their families to go to college. They see teaching as a teacher. The problem is that when we work with our students, they really need support. We're asking them to student teach, which means they have to take time off of work, and a lot of these people have families and a lot of commitments. So the money that we use to support the elite college students to do 2 years of Teach for America and then move on to other careers could be, I think, and we come down in the book, better used to support people who for whom could really use the support and stay in the field and would do a better job of knowing the students from the beginning, because they often come from the communities in which they'll teach, where in the United States, we have 80% of the teachers are white already. So if we need teachers are in this country, the support should be on providing more avenues for a diverse group of teachers to come in and stay in the profession.
Absolutely. Fantastic. And Bethany, would you like to add?
Very quick comment. We still, in America, over 80% of the teachers are white, and we have over 50% of our student population are kids of color. So we have long had this discrepancy. One of the things that Megan and I discovered is there is a lot of conversation about the pipeline. How do we attract diverse candidates? The reality is that most teachers of color leave because of the conditions in which they are working. And so I think that as much as, pre-service teacher training is central, there has to be some kind of equivalent effort towards supporting teachers of color in schools where cultures may not support them if we really want to retain them.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think that brings up a question that Elaine raised around the sort of logistics and the structure behind all of this. So I think it's precisely that. If we're trying to faced with a limited set of resources here, should we be focusing on initial teacher education, or should we be focused on supporting teachers who are in service, making sure that they actually have a really, really solid teaching environment? And it's not zero sum, but on some level it is, unfortunately, financially. And Elaine raised the question about how we could overcome the financial hurdles around collaboration when you have a different financial system and incentive, introducing sort of emergency certification programs where teachers are funded in a completely different way and paid in a different way than they are in the traditional education system. So I'll leave that hanging because I would like to go to Matthew since he has a point, but I hope we can kind of integrate this idea of finances and logistics and how we make this work in practice as well.
No, I was just going to add one point to that discussion from earlier, that I think it's really, again, going back to kind of how we started with thinking about nuance, but I think it's careful to think about the wide range of different models that do exist. And so, you know, I mean, I think it was like 2005, 2006, there was a special issue of a journal in the US focused on Teach for America. And kind of an argument was made in one of the articles saying, why isn't it a 3-year commitment? Like, there's a lot of teacher education research that shows teachers really start to improve at the 3-year mark, and then the 5-year mark, and then they go on and on. But the 2-year mark is kind of challenging. And, you know, Wendy Kopp had the originator of Teach for America, you know, she had an article in that piece and basically said, look, we can't do that, et cetera. So, you know, that would be an example of a different model. There are other residency models in cities around the US and other places that are somewhat similar. You know, from the Australian case, Joe Lampert and Bruce Burnett had this really nice program called the National Exceptional Teachers Program, where they, you know, pulled really top students out of their teacher education program who wanted to commit to teaching in what we would consider high ICSEA or high poverty contexts. And then they had a boutique program where they looked at social cultural theory, and they talked about what it means to teach in these different types of schools. They had particular fit for purpose placements in schools. And the research, you know, from their program basically showed that 90% of them went on to teach in really high ICSEA or high poverty schools. So I think there are a range of different models that we can consider, and it's really important, I think, for us to think creatively about what that looks like, regardless of whether it's in, you know, the new forms.
So then I would invite Susan to share her comment back to David's question on whether the kind of PGCE and other models are really focused on kind of locking people into one type of subject, into one way teaching, and think how standardization and accreditation poses a challenge. So from a kind of governance and systems perspective, what would you respond to David?
Well, it's very, I mean, then basically what you have is a scenario where it's too risky to innovate, because essentially there's a specific set of behaviours and practices that are being looked for. So, I mean, our argument with government at the moment, if they're to run this so-called reaccreditation process where you're locking in a very highly prescribed, what we describe as a procurement, and the possibility of experimenting, of thinking about what kind of teacher for the 21st century, all of that kind of thing, what kind of schools, you erase, because there's no incentive. In fact, quite the reverse. The incentives are very perverse, it seems to me. Just on the issue of, in Cambridge, one of the things, I mean, we do cross-subsidise our program here because we actually say it's really, really important for the mission of the university. And we have an outreach officer who's managed to increase our recruitment of Black, Asian, minority ethnic students, and we have a duty and a responsibility as a university to kind of do that. So some of it is tied to political will and institutional will. And now that's also going to be dependent on strong arguments you place in the university, from, in our case, from a faculty of education to our vice chancellor and so on. But actually what we also know is that our students that train with us, go out to partnership schools and so on, often stay in that region. And the profile of the candidate coming in, who isn't a Teach First candidate, is either a first class honours or a 2-1, primary and secondary, that sits in the 90%. That's extraordinary, actually. So in our case, we're actually being asked to contemplate here in the UK a one-size-fits-all model of teacher training that really, it looks nothing like what we do, and yet what we do is produce outstanding teachers. We're kind of you know, judged to be outstanding, and you'd have to kind of say, what willful government is kind of hell-bent on destroying all of that? And the campaign we've been running really is that every child deserves an outstanding teacher, and every teacher deserves to be as good as they possibly can be. Now, what's the conditions to kind of arrive at that place where it seems to me in England kind of heading off, we're in reverse direction away from that.
Absolutely. And I think this brings us to, I believe, Hiba, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, his point about if teachers are always asked to deliver on high stakes exams or otherwise, to what extent can teacher preparation programs actually innovate? This sort of constraint of the system on transformative ways of preparing educators. So I would, in the last minutes that we have, ask everyone to sort of reflect for a bit on, of course, the many barriers that exist. And we've already alluded to the different ways that systems can maybe function better in concert, actually having dialogue, actually beginning to open up processes that are not just standardized for accreditation, perhaps. But if we could just go around briefly and you could give some thoughts on where we go from here. If we're trying to David Baker's question, I think prepare students to constantly adapt and relearn throughout their lifetimes and prepare them for a very uncertain future, which requires an ever-changing education system. How can we actually rethink the teacher training kind of experience, the teacher preparation and education experience with the broader system in mind? I know that's a big question, but I'm wondering, Susan, if you would start again, going back to you as you're talking about sort of systems and governance, what in your mind would be the one or two changes that, Downing Street that others could make to facilitate Cambridge becoming the best teacher education program it could be?
I just ask them to listen to the professionals in the sector, as opposed to impose and think that they actually know. And then I'd probably say the professionals in the sector, and in fact, we've seen it here in spades over the last month, is coming together and working together in solidarity and politically, and to actually do understand that, in fact, there's a lot to lose if we don't. Actually, and so we have joined up right across the sector, and that would include the school-based teacher trainers. They've been involved in those kind of conversations, and so on. So it's not a question of one lot taking the high ground and to hell with the others. I actually say we take the view here, and we have taken the view that in fact we have a duty of care to the next generation, and that's really important.
That's fantastic. That's lovely. And that's a wonderful North Star to shoot for. So I'd wonder, I assume that resonates with everyone else on this panel as well. Matthew, could we go to you and just think of your kind of final reflections on futures that we're hoping to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe I'll compliment Susan's excellent comments by thinking I think we need to attack these issues at all levels, and so certainly at policy level, at the national level, at the government level, maybe international as well. But certainly even pre-service teachers, and so I have an honor student right now who was just fascinated with the idea of neoliberalism, but didn't really understand it, and so she surveyed all of her peers on their conceptualizations of neoliberalism. And everybody talked about accountability mechanisms and privatization, but they all felt hampered because they were pre-service teachers. They didn't think they could do anything about it. And so I think one of the things that we might be able to do as teacher educators with our current or in-service or pre-service teachers is to think about, okay, there are some systems and structures in place that you might have to work within, but what else can you do? What can you do beyond that? How can you appropriate some of those policies in ways that might actually be advantageous to your students? And I'm not sure we've really thought systematically about how to do that in teaching.
Fantastic. There's so much.
I think if the larger government and administration wants to be supportive of teacher education, I think they could put their energy into looking at the context of education and at looking at supporting what's happening in schools by thinking about housing and mental health and health insurance for poor families, and all the different concentric circles that surround the school that make it so difficult to teach. I think we're asking teachers truly, and I know that people say this is a defensive stance, but we're asking them to do too much. We can provide high quality teachers, but I think that the government needs to come in and do some rethinking and support of schools so that teachers can use their professional knowledge and be successful.
Well, and I think that goes to Susan's point as well on language of this, educating with the kind of the hope of really broad systems mindset change over the lifetime. And I think that this goes to a point that you and Bethany brought up when we earlier of kind of working with human lives at the most formative moments. So closing it off for us, Bethany, I'm curious your thoughts on how systems, how individuals, how educators and educator trainers might think about moving forward.
I think most people have spoken about kind of these larger power levers, government. I'm going to start from the other end, which is, I think, if there could be some support for developing lots of different examples where you see schools in concert with communities, particular community contexts, and teachers could do, pre-service teachers could do residencies where they got deep mentoring from teachers, and you had some really strong examples of what it could look like in different contexts. Honestly, I feel like that could help drive the discussion from below in a way that offers, again, concrete examples of here is how it looks and works, which I feel like a lot of the conversation gets to be, and I was thinking about this when Susan was talking about how they just come in and say, this is going to be in the, you know, certification or that, like real images of what this looks like and what it is that gets beyond kind of the rhetoric.
So I think whenever we're talking about change and policy and innovation, we always circle back to this idea of participation and dialogue and co-creative design. So I'm glad that that continues to be a theme that we're going to pick up on in all of our discussions and seminars and work with CERIP into the future. So unfortunately, we are past time, but I want to extend my greatest thanks to our wonderful, wonderful panel. Again, especially to Matthew for staying up so late with us, for their wonderful insights and really, really, I think, incredibly. So we're going to send out the information, the Twitter handles, the book titles of all of our panelists to everyone who attended today, but I invite you to also subscribe to the CERIP newsletter so that we can get you involved in the coming events. And I know that we'd be delighted to welcome our wonderful panelists back for more discussions, because the conversation on teacher education is not ending today by any means. So thank you to everyone. Thank you for those who asked questions as well. And again, to Elaine and Paula. And we really look forward to welcoming you at CERIP events in the future.